Hi, and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Seth Grissom, and I'm Program Director for K-12 Education here at the National Governors Association. Welcome to our conversation today with Dr. Jason Grissom of Vanderbilt University on the impact of high-quality principals and school leaders on students, teachers, and schools. Please note that this recording is the latest in NGA's State Snapshots for Strengthening the Educator Workforce webinar series. Please check out the 13 earlier webinars in this ongoing series, including with Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, Dr. Constance Lindsay, Dr. Paul Manna, Dr. Steve Tozer, and Dr. Jackie Wilson. These webinars are supported by and in partnership with the Wallace Foundation. The Wallace Foundation works to support principal and school leader preparation, development, and support across the country. Their Wallace Knowledge Center has multiple resources, tools, and reports on state strategies for school leadership, including the one we're going to discuss today with Dr. Grissom. You can find these resources at wallacefoundation.org or through a direct link on the NGA K-12 webpage. Today, I'm honored to engage in a conversation with Dr. Jason Grissom, Patricia and Rhodes Hart Professor of Public Policy and Education at Vanderbilt University and Faculty Director of the Tennessee Education Research Alliance. With that introduction, let's dive into the conversation with Dr. Grissom. Dr. Grissom, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Before we dive into specific questions, please tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to focus on school leadership.
Sure, happy to, Seth, and appreciate the invitation to be here today. So I'll go way back. So I grew up in a high poverty rural school district in North Carolina, where I had lots of opportunities to become keenly aware, of the differences in educational resources that are available to students across schools and across school districts. And so when I went to graduate school, I really wanted to understand the system level determinants of educational inequity, and from a political and an economic perspective, because I was thinking about systems. And so I went to Stanford, where I completed an MA in education and a PhD in political economics. And initially, I was really focused on issues of state and school district policy. But the more that I delved into what differentiated successful from unsuccessful schools, the more I really came to realize this huge role that leaders at the school level play. And so my research became more and more focused on school leaders. And what's interesting about the one from when I guess with my training studying school leaders is that I tend to approach the topic from a point of view of, what can we learn from large scale data? So what patterns can we see? And so I tend to draw a lot on administrative data sets from states and districts on survey data. I also do a lot of observations and interviews, though. Again, I try to do those on a larger scale as well. I just think it's important to try to be representative of the many different contexts that in which school leaders operate. So that's the work that I do now.
That's great. I really appreciate that background and how, seeing the research, starting to dig in, you saw the impacts, and that made you want to work on it more throughout your career. So from that, you mentioned this a little bit, but from a foundational level, why for our audience are principals so critical for student, teacher, and school success? Why should governors particularly focus in on principal and school leader development and support?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say principals are responsible for so much of what happens in a school. And so, we think of the quality of instruction and relationships between teachers and students in a classroom as being the most important in-school factor in student success. We hear that a lot. And I think it's right. But who creates the conditions for that work to happen? Who hires the teachers? Who works to get them the resources they need? Who sets the tone for the school's climate? Who ensures that the school is safe and well-disciplined so the teacher can teach? That work's all led by the principal and by the administrative team in the school. So how effective they are can really be the difference between a school being a high-performing school and being a school that isn't so high-performing. And so, that means that states, I think, really should be thinking of school leaders as a policy target. How can we build this core of strong principals in the state and ensure they get into the schools that need them most? We have lots of effective leaders in the system. We don't have a universal set of effective leaders. One of the things we see in the research, though, is more effective leaders over time tend to gravitate towards more advantaged schools. The schools that have more built-in disadvantages tend tend to have less success attracting and retaining high quality leaders. And that's something states can be thinking about, how to create the conditions to ensure that distribution of leadership effectiveness becomes more equitable along the way to building a core of universally effective principals, which is of course ultimately what we want. But so that means thinking about how do we develop, how do we prepare future leaders, what expectations do we set for them, how can we support them in a job that's incredibly tough, trying to meet those expectations that we set, how do we compensate them, so forth. There's a lot of different kinds of ways of thinking from a policy perspective at the state level about how to address school leadership. The most important thing, I think, is to recognize the importance and to have one of those strategies.
Yeah, I really like how you put that in terms of very helpful about, teacher impact, vitally important, but really thinking about the principal as setting the conditions, the environment for that work to continue, and then the leadership for teachers to be able to make the impact they need to make with students in that school. Just to follow up on that, in terms of the role of the principal and school leader, you released this report we mentioned a little earlier with two co-authors with Wallace Foundation, How Principals Affect Students in Schools, a systematic synthesis of 2 decades of research. Is an update to literature review that was published last in 2004, How Leadership Influences Student Learning. So what, in your estimation, between the two reports, most changed? How did the principalship evolve during that time, do you feel like?
Yeah, I think the context of school leadership changed in the essentially 20 years between the two reports. So you can think about all of the things that were happening in the policy environment that principals have had to respond to. So the previous report was they stopped with studies in 2000. So everything that's happened since 2000, it's different. So you think about NCLB and sort of the rise of high stakes accountability systems and what that has meant for how schools function. So that's a pretty big difference contextually for principals. There's a much bigger focus on engagement with teachers' instruction than there used to be, 25 or 30 years ago for principals, where principals were seen historically much more as like the manager of the building or in charge of operations. And that remains important, but there's, layered on much more of an expectation that principals are playing a kind of leadership role in the instructional realm. One place that we've seen that has represented its own big change is in state and district investment in multiple measure teacher evaluation systems, which that was a big move in the sort of 2010s to think about, well, how can we make teacher observation rigorous? We create standards, and we're gonna train people to go in with a very structured rubric for giving teachers feedback on instruction. Well, who's doing that? The principal and their administrative team. So that has had really profound impacts on school leadership, both in how it has restructured principals' work weeks, because now they're doing all of these very structured observations and holding feedback conferences, but also in the information that it provides to principals that they can then use for strategic planning within their schools, or not. Some principals don't use the data probably to their full advantage. So that's a difference. I think there's much more of an attention also to equity in school systems and for principals, thinking about outcomes for students from diverse backgrounds and what is the role, not only in thinking about having a high performing school, where the average kid is succeeding, but also what does it mean to thinking much more about sort of all kids' success and what the principal's role is in ensuring that all kids are getting what they need to be successful in that school. And one other I will say, which even is maybe less apparent, I think, is sort of the ubiquity of school choice in the system, which obviously is really important if you are in a school of choice, if you're your charter school principal, for example. But also, I think the ubiquity of school choice has made differences for principals in traditional public schools, because principals much more now have to play a kind of salesperson or marketing role for their schools as well. There's the external relations piece of the job has morphed as there's more competition over kids in a sense in a lot of states. So I think there's just lots of different ways in which the environment in which school leaders operated have changed in the last 20 or 25 years. And so that created, I think, the impetus for saying, well, what have we learned in the last 20 years about school leadership, and what makes someone successful? And that was what we tried to dig into in the report.
That's really helpful. Really thinking about the policy environment. And I don't know if I had even realized from that report that they were really pulling from 2000. So you're talking, like you said, 21 year period or so, or 20-year period. A lot of change there, including the choice conversation. And then I just want to like highlight for our audience, just around what you were saying around the manager to instructional leader conversation, and how it's not that one has changed over, but they're doing both of those roles now. And that's a change as well, from a little more emphasis on instructional leader, but still a manager.
Yeah, and it's actually a really important thing to highlight, because one of the things I hear from principals all the time is the expectations just keep getting layered on. No one ever takes anything away. So, one of the implications for how the job has changed, I think, is that the job has gotten a lot harder. Now, that's not something we talk about in the report necessarily, but I think that our expectations for principals have become very high. It's not as if we're not, lots of districts, we're trying to support them differently, but we're not drastically restructure our approach to leadership in terms of how a principal's workday is structured and so forth. But we've added lots that we expect them to accomplish essentially in the same amount of time. And so one of the things that I think is a result of that is one of the things that we do see is that people are spending less time in the principalship, which is something we document in the report as well. And so I think that the job is getting harder. People's tenures in the job are getting shorter, and I think that's something for people at the state level to be conscious of as well.
And what can sports can then be put in place to stem that a little bit. You mentioned being able to identify in the report some of the key behaviors and skills of what makes the principal effective. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so happy to. So let me say a little bit about how we got to it, because I think that's sort of helpful. So what we were sort of charged by the Wallace Foundation with doing in this report is this big systematic search, as we said, 20 years of literature, last 20 years of literature on the school principal. And specifically, we were looking at studies that were connecting principals to student outcomes. That was the specific lens that we were taking. And so we started by doing this enormous search of all of these different databases that contain these scholarly studies. And we ended up with 4,800 of those. So it was a pretty massive set of studies. And then we just spent months and months screening those studies. So reading them and screening them down, for relevance, to make sure that it was covering the right topic, but also for rigor, which was really important to us. We didn't want to just include every study that had ever been written about school principals, because they don't all, they don't all sort of have the same, let's say, quality of evidence in them. And so we were screening on rigor of methods as well. And so this many-month process got us down to 219 studies that we considered sort of the best studies on the connection between principals and student achievement, other student outcomes. And that was a mix of studies. I mean, it was quantitative studies, it was qualitative studies. There were inclusion criteria for both, but we were really trying to get at the studies that were sort of the best, that used the best available quantitative and qualitative methods. And then we categorized those studies to say, well, what are these studies collectively telling us about what makes a principal effective? And so from that categorization, we identified 3 skill areas and 4 domains of behavior. And I'll mention the 3 skill areas real briefly, but I'll focus a bit more on the domains of behavior I think are more interesting. So we one of the things in terms of skills, the thing we sort of highlight is the skill expectations for principals are pretty broad. We identify skills that we call people skills, instructional skills, and organizational skills. So, principals need, when we say people skills, we mean skills related to relationships, human development, caring, communication, interaction with other adults and kids. Instructional skills are the skills that you need to support teacher instruction, which is as we were just saying, a key part of a principal's work. So as an example of that kind of skill, like, do you have the capacity to be able to go into a classroom and differentiate high quality from low quality instruction? That's a skill. That's a skill that can be honed, but that is a skill. And then we talk about organizational skills, or we actually say skills for the organization, because what we're really trying to highlight is principals also need skills that are management skills that they would need if they were running a nonprofit, or they were running a hospital, or they were running, complex organizations, schools or not, require a set of organizational management skills. that principals need. So, budgeting, data analysis, and so forth. So that's the sort of skill bucket there. And so what we highlight in the report is that these three broad and overlapping skill areas are supporting four key domains of behavior. So those, let me say a little bit more about. So the first of those we call engaging in instructionally focused interactions with teachers. That's a little bit wordy, but we didn't want to say instructional leadership, which is what a lot of people use when talking about this set of stuff. I don't like the phrase instructional leadership at all because it is used to death. It does not it is so elastic, it has no meaning. Each person you say instructional leadership to, they sort of think they know what you're talking about, and everybody probably is thinking of something a little bit different. We wanted to be precise. So we talk about instructionally focused interactions. And what do I mean by that? That means interactions with teachers around that are specifically around instructional engagement. So the research suggests that what successful principals are doing is they are using evaluation and observation well. Okay, they're doing a good job with classroom observation. They're using what they observe in classrooms for high quality feedback. They're using what they observe in classrooms and what they observe in other sorts of data sources for planning for professional learning and support opportunities for teachers that are differentiated to those teachers' specific needs. And so that's what we mean by instructional engagement. It's a much more specific way of thinking about what principals should be doing with instruction. They're not supposed to be master teachers. They're not supposed to be the person that can go in and say, oh, I can teach this class better than you. That's not this domain. This is about how you engage with teachers around instruction specific for instructional support, right? So that's the first big one. The next two are kind of related to one another. We call those building a productive climate and facilitating collaboration and professional learning community. And you might say, well, isn't collaboration a kind of component of climate? And the answer is yes, it is, but we call out the collaboration piece because it seems to be so important that we wanted to highlight it as a bit distinct from more generic notion of what a productive climate is. So when we say building a productive climate, what we're talking about here are practices that encourage an environment that's marked by things like trust, feelings of efficacy. The people in the building believe students can learn, and I know how to help them do that. A sense of continuous improvement. We're all trying to get better all the time. Communication. We care for one another, etc. Right? So there are steps principals can take to try to influence the climate if they have a climate focus to influence a climate to move in that direction, right? And then related to that is facilitating collaboration. So teacher collaboration is really important. There's a lot of research that suggests creating conditions for teachers to work together authentically around student achievement will increase student achievement. Teachers have a lot of expertise they can leverage from one another. But one of the things we talk about in education sometimes is the egg crate classroom, that every teacher is sort of in their own classroom and not getting sufficient opportunities to interact with one another. What strong principals are doing is they're creating the conditions for teachers to work together in this really meaningful way where they can learn from one another. They can look at individual student data and say, this student is struggling in this area. What suggestions do you have for me? What can I do? And principals creating conditions for that kind of authentic collaboration to happen seems to be really important, according to the research that we reviewed. And then the last one we call managing personnel and other resources strategically. And this relates a bit to what you might think this grows directly out of that organizational management skill that we were talking about before, and certainly is related. But these are this is strategic staffing. Is one way of thinking about this, and this is also strategic allocation of other resources in the school, which includes time, including the principal's time, like having, allocating your time to the right goals. That's a strategic resource allocation sort of decision, but then also strategic hiring, strategic placement of teachers, strategic retention. Not, you probably want to retain most teachers in your school. You certainly want to retain the effective ones. Not every teacher in your school needs to be retained. Some teachers would be better off working elsewhere. That is a strategic retention decision. And so what the research suggests is that principals that are sort of firing on all cylinders in those four areas, those are the principals that are seeing the most positive outcomes in their schools.
Really helpful. And I'm just going to sort of summarize a little bit of those domains that you were saying, because I think they're so important. So really looking at instructionally focused intentions, looking at the productive climate that's being created, the conditions for collaboration that's present in the school, and managing personnel, including strategically thinking about staffing and resources as sort of the four big domains. One thing it just made me think of, Dr. Grissom, is just in these schools, and maybe this is a separate study, but we know how important student collaboration is, and teamwork, and being able to have attributes for students. Were you able to see, or do you have a sense of whether teachers working together better, and principals sort of creating that conditions for educators working together in that way, also provides a model for students in that school, and there's more of a positive effect for that occurring as well in the school?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the key insights about school climate and culture among adults is what you might think is trickle down is not the right word, but the ways that it influences kids' interactions as well, because the students in a school are learning by observing the ways that the adults in the school interact and behave as well. And so I would say not just with collaboration, but other aspects of climate. One of the reasons you're trying to get this work so right among the teachers, the other instructional and non-instructional staff in the school, is because what it means for the ways then that kids are going to interact with the adults in the building and also with one another.
That's great, really helpful. We're still coming, or just in the aftermath of the pandemic here, and coming out of it. What was your sense? You released this report sort of mid pandemic. What's your sense of those principals that had some of these key behaviors and skills? How did it help to sort of make their way through, continue that effectiveness in their school, create the conditions continually in a time of great change and evolution?
Yeah, so it is a funny situation when you work so many years on a report and then you sort of release it at a time when you immediately wonder whether or not everything that you have done has sort of become irrelevant because the conditions have changed so much. But I don't think, fortunately, I don't think that is the situation that we were in. But I think that COVID-19 impacted principals a lot because it presented so many different challenges, right, in schools. And the whole world turned upside down, but certainly the world in schools turned upside down in a very visible sort of way. And principals were responsible for dealing with all those challenges. I think if anything, it highlighted just how important principals are. Because suddenly principals have to think about this, this big challenge of how do I orchestrate the core business of the school, which is teaching and learning, when the conditions have changed so much. And some of them were really successful. And I think we're still learning about why, right? So it's going to be some years before people like me are sort of digging into what differentiated the schools that were the most successful coming out of the dealing with the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. But I suspect that the successful ones were still focused on these same domains of practice that we're talking about. They're just focused on them in a different way because the conditions change, right? So the engagement with these practices necessarily had to change, even if it's still the same domains. So let's take the one we were talking about, engaging with teachers' instruction. So if you think that's a key leadership focus, that a central tenet of your work as a school leader is engaging with teachers to think about what's happening that's great in a teacher's classroom, what's happening in a teacher's classroom that could work differently, and how I build in feedback, coaching, and other kinds of supports to reinforce the things that should be reinforced, and also work on the things that maybe would be challenges in that classroom. If that's the way that if I think that's a central component of my work, I'll figure out how to do that in a virtual environment, right? Or as kids are coming back in person, I'm going to tilt my engagement with instruction to really focus it on students' new learning needs, all that students missed, right, when they were not in an in-person instruction, which we know is so important, right? So I'm going to be engaging. I'm going to be engaging maybe in different ways and maybe with a different focus, but I'm going to still lean my leadership practice on the idea that engagement with teacher instruction is a core thing that I'm supposed to do. And I think you could map each one of these sort of domains of practice. For each one, you could say, okay, the work probably looked different, but it was still, we're still capturing, I think, the core of what the work was. At the same time, I think the pandemic also highlighted some facets, sort of, let's say, new facets of the principal's job that we weren't as cognizant of before. Okay, they weren't covered in our big synthesis because we hadn't really had the occasion to think about them as much prior to the pandemic, and now we think about them a lot. So, we understand school safety much differently in 2023 than we did in 2019, because we think a lot about the principal's role in promoting health within their school, for example. And maybe we didn't think about that as much before. And so I think that's important. Another one is, I think we really now recognize the importance of crisis leadership. I don't think that phrase appears in our report at all. But recognizing some schools and some districts were much better positioned to meet the challenges of the pandemic because they had plans in place to ensure that they had the right resources, they had the right communication systems, and so forth. And so I think crisis leadership is something we're going to be thinking about a lot more. And that's something actually that I've written about a little bit since the report came out, because I think that's something that as a field we had missed a little bit. We think about crisis leadership a lot in other sectors, but we had not thought about it so much in schools. And schools are confronting crises all the time. Maybe they're not all COVID-19 level crises, but having that sort of those sort of skills and plans in place, I think we're now recognizing are really important as well. So I think COVID-19, is going to present lots of opportunities for learning, for about lots of things, right? But leaders included, and that learning will be, I think, unfolding over the coming years.
Really helpful. I really like how you spoke about the mindset and habits of mind that formed even pre-pandemic and how that carried forward to being able to address different situations. And then now thinking about different areas, health and crisis leadership that you've written about. So, and we'll make sure audience, not just the report that we're talking about today, but also some of Dr. Grissom's other writings on this topic, including crisis leadership, are included in the resources. I want to mention the federal funding. It's just an influx of federal funding over the last number of years for education, and governors right now thinking about how to prioritize as that money starts to go away, going forward, what to prioritize, what to keep, what to sustain going forward. So what have you seen as some of the ways that states and districts have spent these funds on principals and school leaders, and what do you think were some good practices that they should think about keeping going forward?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, especially as we think about the money going away. I like the way you phrased it, thinking about, well, what investments do we want to sustain? I think there's you can sort of, okay, so I think you can sort of think about investments that you make in preparing people to become school principals. So everything that comes up to the point that the person is hired. And then you can think about what happens from the moment a person is hired and how they're supported throughout that career. And I think those things are going to clearly be connected to one another. And they should be connected. If you have the right strategy, you're really thinking about aligning the systems that support a person sort of throughout that full pipeline. But I think, but to talk about them separately for a second, I think investment in pre-service learning opportunities is really important, because you learn a lot on the job, but you need to be prepared on day one to be able to, school leadership is too important for people to spend a couple of years learning how to do the job, right? And so having pre-service supports in place that are pre-service learning opportunities in place that are high quality is really important, I think, for states to think about. And traditional university-based preparation programs may not get you all the way that you want to go. A lot of leadership is very context specific. I think states are thinking a lot about what are pre-service learning opportunities look like at the district level, where the learning really can be grounded in that local context. And so creating that can be in partnership with another organization like a university. I'm not saying the universities, I work in one, I think universities provide a lot of value, but in really thinking about what the local contextual needs are. And so investing in these, local pipeline, local residency kinds of models, creating opportunities for leaders to really get on the job leadership experience, in a structured kind of way. That can include, job shadowing. It can include internships. It can include working with a mentor or coach to prepare as I go through a cohort with a cohort of other learners within my district. Or if I'm in a rural area, maybe it's within a consortium of rural districts that are going to combine forces to make it not totally inefficient to run a program for a single leader. So I think really thinking about high quality pre-service preparation opportunities, that's a really worthy place for investment. And I think that's a place that a lot of states have been focused. Where I think a lot of states have thought about use of COVID dollars has been more on this once people are in the principal job and what can we do to support them. And here either with federal dollars or with other sources, I think we're seeing a lot of promising models. So the first thing is that principal professional learning and support is really important. In a lot of districts, there just isn't very much. There isn't that much infrastructure. Principals are sort of viewed as, the king or queen of their domain, and they're just left to sort of do the job with fairly minimal supports. And I think that's exactly the wrong way to approach it. It's a really hard job. And as I said before, it gets harder all the time. And so what I think we really need to be thinking about, what infrastructure we need to be putting around that job to help set people up for success. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I think there's been this move to really think about reforming principal supervision. The people thinking about basically the supervisors or the people that the principal directly reports to. Historically, that's just been a very management-oriented job, but really thinking about that as a development of instructional leadership, for lack of a better word, kind of job. That my job as the supervisor of principals is to really grow my principals and think about how to improve their practice. What kind of learning opportunities then do I create for those folks? Revision that job and then invest in helping them work with principals one-on-one to improve principal practice. So that's an example of a recent move that I think lots of school districts have made, recognizing that that's a lever that they can pull. I think there's lots of coaching work that's happening that is very high quality, recognizing that professionals in executive kinds of positions in other sectors benefit tons from having coaches, and principals are the same way. Like having opportunities to bounce ideas off of knowledgeable others, maybe people who have experience in the role, that can give feedback and that can give insight and that can help people navigate really tough situations. Increasingly, I think we are seeing school districts have lots of success with structured kinds of coaching or mentoring relationships. Those are not free because you really have to invest in having those coaches on hand, having a small enough ratio of coaches to principals that person can be accessible and valuable to that principal, et cetera. But I think we're seeing increasingly districts really seeing payoffs in terms of leadership quality from being able to make those kinds of investments. I think those are sort of the kinds of things I would be thinking about. If I was at the state level, I would be thinking about, well, what can I do directly in terms of setting standards for things like pre-service preparation, and maybe also setting standards for in-service in-service support, but also what kinds of resources can I be making available to school districts so that districts then in turn can spend those dollars in ways that they're investing in the things that can help the districts meet their specific needs.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. So thinking about not only preparing, but how we support principals, school leaders once they're in their school and through preparation, thinking about preparation, the local context, and thinking about not only university preparation, but district-led efforts. And then on the supporting side, thinking about mentoring and coaching. And you mentioned principal supervision as another way to get at the effectiveness of principals and the impact they can make. As we think about, you've mentioned now the levers and some of the changes that have been good in terms of like states and districts that you've seen across the country. Can you specifically name a few that you would point to as examples?
Sure. I mean, I think if listeners are interested in thinking about these comprehensive systems of learning and supports for principals, a really good place to start is the Wallace Foundation has what's called the Principal Pipeline Initiative, and there are a series of reports on the Wallace Foundation website documenting the experiences of the districts that the Wallace Foundation supported to really invest in pipelines. And by pipelines, I mean, pipelines of people into the profession, but also thinking the pipeline, continuing and aligning what those learning experiences look like along that pathway. And there's some really good examples. So I'll point listeners to Long Beach, California, Long Beach Unified in particular, and the model that district has put together for thinking about how to do this very intentionally with an equity focus, where there were clear standards for what districts are expecting of their leaders, like setting a sort of North Star to say, this is what we think high quality leadership practice looks like in our school district. And then what are all of the places along the pipeline that we can create learning opportunities of different types to get us to the place where every school has a principal that can meet those expectations. So that is an example, but there are others that I think looking at the Principal Pipeline Initiative work can really point people to. I think this idea, I think, and that work was taking place actually before our report came out, but the way that it fits with our report is, I think that where school districts are really successful is where there are clear standards or a clear framework for orienting those leadership efforts. That's actually a place that states can play a role, because states can set what the leadership standards are for that state. Like these are our expectations for what high quality principal work is. And maybe it needs to be adapted and create opportunities for local school districts to adapt those state standards specifically to their local context. But having those standards in place is really a first step. Every state needs to have high quality leadership standards. And how that fits with our report is, my personal view is that maybe the standards that we have had prior, not that they were incorrect, but maybe they didn't emphasize exactly the right things. And I think what our report has done is maybe brought a little bit of emphasis to say, yes, we've known for, principal standards have said for a long time that there is something around instruction and instructional work that is important for the principalship. And what we've tried to say is, right, but it's this stuff, it's this more narrow conceptualization. We really want to build skills for instruction in ways that are going to support teachers to teach sort of the best they can, use leadership as a lever for addressing, for engaging in teacher support. Well, here's where we need to focus. And so, I've had conversations with school districts and with some states about thinking about, how the framework that we present in our report might be the kind of framework that, that can guide these kinds of development efforts. And I do think having a framework that everyone agrees on, has bought into, gives everyone a common language and understanding of what high quality leadership in that geographic space is a clear first step. You need that because you need to know where you're going, and then you can think about, well, what are the different components, these learning opportunities, these support opportunities that I need to build in order to ensure that people are meeting the expectations of that framework.
Great, yeah, clear framework, clear standards, and that can come from the state level. You mentioned as a district example, Long Beach Unified district leadership there. And then we had Lana Berry, education advisor for Governor Carney, on just a few weeks ago, talking about Delaware's example of how they've been able to set some clear standards and frameworks. So a good state example of that as well. And I know it has made a lot of difference in that state. As we end up here, where do you see your work in the field headed next? What are you most excited about in the next few months?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm really interested sort of in this space of thinking about effective leadership. I'm really interested in principals equity work, which is something we get into in the report a little bit, but I think this is an area, as I was saying, I think the increasing expectations for school leaders around equity, those expectations are increasing all the time. And I think really trying to understand what principals who are really doing a great job in trying to ensure equity in their schools, what are they doing and how can we document that? That's something I'm really excited about. I think, related to this, I'm doing a lot of work on leader diversity, like pipelines of people of color and women into leadership what those pipelines look like, what the barriers that we encounter in those pipelines. And I'm always interested in what generically we call labor market issues, issues around leader compensation, how that relates to leader turnover, strategies that we have around principal hiring. And I have a big project right now that is thinking about, related to that, that's thinking about how can we identify the competencies that people have before they move into the principalship, that we can either select on or that we can think about for development purposes, and what kinds of information will we need to be collecting about from people in their pre-service years that could tell us something about their sort of likelihood of leadership success. So that's a multi-year project that I'm engaged in right now here in Tennessee. But those are, and actually the framework for that we're using for that project in terms of thinking about what kinds of competencies we are assessing against is the same framework that I was talking about, like the framework that comes out of this report. So it all sort of links together. So those are some of the things that I'm really excited about at the moment.
Great. Leader diversity and selection of principals, just even in their preparation programs and how those attributes impact their effectiveness once on the job. So we'll loop back with you in a few years or so, or in a year or so, and see how that research is going. I'm sure it'll be impactful. It always is. So thanks, Dr. Grissom, for a great conversation and sharing your expertise and insights today. Viewers, please note, as I mentioned earlier, all reports and resources discussed during this webinar will be attached to the recording once it's posted to the NGA website. So until next time, thanks for tuning in and have a great day.